Nobody asked why income tax didn't exist before 1913. Nobody questioned how cities functioned without electric bills, water bills, or property taxes. Nobody wondered how entire populations lived in architectural masterpieces without paying utilities. The official story says modern taxation emerged from progress, from growing government needs, from the complexity of industrial. But the timeline tells a different story. A story where the introduction of mandatory taxation coincides perfectly with the disappearance of something else, something that made taxation unnecessary. Before 1913, the federal income tax didn't exist in America. Not as a temporary measure, not as an oversight. It was unconstitutional. The 16th Amendment changed that, ratified on the 3rd of February 1913, creating the legal framework for permanent federal income taxation. The official explanation focuses on funding government operations, on modernizing revenue collection, on preparing for potential war expenditures, standard civics textbook material. But nobody explains why, for over 130 years of American history, the nation functioned perfectly well without it. Nobody addresses what changed so fundamentally in 1913 that suddenly, for the first time, every working citizen needed to surrender a portion of their labor to federal authority. The same year, the 23rd of December 1913, the Federal Reserve Act passed, centralizing control over American currency and credit. Two massive transformations of the financial system in a single year. Two fundamental restructurings of how money moves, who controls it, and who pays for the privilege of using it. The timing seems almost coordinated. Pull up photographs of American cities from the 1890s. Not promotional images, not postcards designed to impress, but documentary photographs showing everyday urban life. What stands out immediately is the architecture. Massive neoclassical buildings, elaborate facades, structures that required extraordinary engineering and craftsmanship, courthouses, libraries, train stations, administrative centers, all built with a consistency of style and quality that seems impossible given the supposed resources and technology of the era. The official narrative explains these as products of the city beautiful movement, of Beaux Arts influence, of industrial prosperity enabling grand civic projects. But here is what that narrative never addresses. These buildings share specific features that make no functional sense for their stated purpose. Enormous windows positioned too high for normal human use. Ventilation systems built into the architecture itself, not added later. Copper roofing extending far beyond practical rain protection. Decorative elements that, upon closer examination, aren't decorative at all but components of a system. A system nobody talks about because acknowledging it would require explaining what it was for. Stand inside one of these old buildings, the ones that haven't been gutted and renovated. Notice the ceiling height. 15, sometimes 20 feet in ordinary working rooms, not grand halls designed to impress. Notice the window placement, how they're positioned to catch light at specific angles throughout the day. Notice the air circulation, how these buildings remain naturally cool in summer, without air conditioning, naturally ventilated without mechanical systems. The architecture itself regulates temperature, manages airflow, optimizes light, as if the building was designed as an integrated environmental system, not just a shelter with walls and a roof. The standard explanation calls this good design, clever use of passive systems, the wisdom of builders who understood their climate, all true. But it doesn't explain the consistency. It doesn't explain how buildings across different climates, different regions, different continents, all employ the same principles with the same mathematical precision. It doesn't explain the copper domes, the specific geometric patterns in the facades, the curious placement of metal elements that serve no obvious structural purpose, unless they served another purpose entirely. Throughout the 1800s, researchers and inventors explored atmospheric electricity, not the tame, controlled electricity we use today, but the ambient electrical potential that exists naturally in the atmosphere. Benjamin Franklin's experiments with lightning are famous, but they represent only the beginning. By the mid-1800s, inventors worldwide were documenting atmospheric electrical phenomena, measuring potential differences between Earth and sky, experimenting with collection methods. Nikola Tesla's later work built on decades of prior research that suggested the atmosphere itself was an energy source waiting to be tapped. Then something strange happened. After the 1890s, research into atmospheric electricity shifted, not abandoned, but redirected. The focus moved from collection and utilization to understanding lightning protection, to studying weather phenomena, to academic curiosity rather than practical application. The drive to harness atmospheric electricity, which had consumed researchers for decades, simply faded from the scientific mainstream, as if someone decided certain questions weren't worth pursuing anymore. Now look at those old buildings again. Look at the copper domes. Copper is an excellent electrical conductor. Look at the metal ornaments at the peaks of spires and towers. Look at the grounding systems, the elaborate networks of metal running through the structure. Look at the geometric patterns in stonework, patterns that some researchers have noted resemble antenna arrays or resonance chambers. The official explanation calls these architectural flourishes, decorative choices, aesthetic decisions. But what if they weren't decorations? What if they were components? The possibility becomes impossible to ignore. What if these buildings were designed to collect and utilize atmospheric electricity? What if the elaborate architectural features served a dual purpose, beauty and function, form following an electrical engineering principle we've been taught to forget? What if the reason nobody paid electric bills before 1880 wasn't because electricity didn't exist, but because buildings generated their own power from the environment itself? Property taxes present another curious timeline. Before the mid-1800s, property taxation existed, but functioned very differently. Land was taxed, certainly, but the structures themselves, the buildings, were often exempt or taxed at nominal rates. The logic seems strange to modern thinking. In an agricultural economy, land had clear value for production. But buildings? Buildings were just there, part of the landscape, not commodities to be continuously taxed for their mere existence. Then, starting around 1850 and accelerating through the 1880s, property tax systems changed. Suddenly, buildings became primary tax targets. Structures, not just land, carried heavy annual tax burdens. The official explanation credits this to urbanization, to the growth of cities where buildings held more value than agricultural land. Reasonable enough, except the timing aligns too perfectly with something else. Maps from before 1850 show something peculiar across Central and Northern Asia, a vast territory labeled Tartary or Tartaria. Not speculation, not myth. An actual designated region appearing on maps produced by every major European cartographic institution. French maps, Dutch maps, British maps, Russian maps, all showing the same territory with the same name. Then, between 1850 and 1890, that label disappears, not conquered and renamed, not absorbed through documented political processes, just erased. The land remains, obviously, but the name vanishes, replaced with Russia in the west, Qing China in the east, various smaller designations in between. The explanation offered, when anyone bothers to explain, is that Tartary was always just a vague geographic term, a placeholder for regions Europeans didn't fully understand. But that explanation requires accepting that European cartographers, who were precise enough to map coastlines and trade routes with remarkable accuracy, suddenly became vague and imprecise when labeling the single largest landmass on their maps. It requires ignoring that these maps marked cities in Tartarian territory, indicated trade routes, showed governmental centers. It requires pretending that a name used consistently for centuries meant nothing. What if it meant something? What if Tartary represented an actual civilization, one with its own governance, its own infrastructure, its own architectural and technological systems. What if the buildings we attribute to 19th century industrial expansion were actually inherited structures, already standing when the current political order claimed them? Consider what that would mean for taxation. If buildings already existed, complete with functional energy systems requiring no fuel, no utility connections, no ongoing operational costs, then what justification exists for taxing them? The modern property tax system assumes buildings require infrastructure, require services, require ongoing government support to remain functional. But what if they didn't? What if these structures were self-sufficient, designed to operate independently of centralized systems? Then the entire rationale for property taxation collapses. Unless ownership of the buildings changes, unless the people inheriting or discovering these structures aren't the ones who built them, unless there is a need to establish legal claim over infrastructure that predates the current political system. The 1890s saw an explosion of government buildings constructed across America. Courthouses, post offices, customs houses, administrative centers. The official explanation calls this a natural result of westward expansion and growing bureaucratic needs. Federal construction projects employed thousands, stimulated local economies, represented American progress and prosperity. Standard narrative. But the construction timelines are impossible. Take the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Official records claim the entire White City, hundreds of elaborate neoclassical buildings covering 600 acres, was designed and constructed in just under 3 years, using 1890s technology. With labor forces that allegedly learned advanced masonry, sculpture, and architectural techniques on the job. The buildings featured elaborate plasterwork, massive domes, intricate facades, all supposedly thrown together on accelerated schedules that would challenge modern construction firms with power tools, computer-aided design, and mechanized equipment. Photographs of the exposition show structures of breathtaking sophistication, but photographs of the construction process are curiously sparse. Some scaffolding, some work crews, but nothing documenting the kind of massive, coordinated building effort that would be required. And after the exposition ended, nearly all these magnificent structures were demolished, torn down within months. The official reason: they were always meant to be temporary, built with staff, a plaster, like material over wooden frames. Except staff doesn't explain the scale, the precision, the architectural details that match permanent stone buildings worldwide. It doesn't explain why temporary exposition buildings employed the same design principles, the same mathematical proportions, the same mysterious features as supposedly permanent government structures, unless they weren't built in 3 years, unless they were already there. The pattern repeats worldwide. Melbourne, a colonial outpost, suddenly boasts exhibition halls rivaling European cathedrals. San Francisco, rebuilt after the 1906 earthquake, produces elaborate beaux arts buildings in impossibly short time frames. Cities across South America, Africa, Asia, all feature neoclassical architecture that official histories credit to local construction, despite no documented evidence of the labor forces, supply chains, or expertise required. What if these buildings were inheritance? What if the late 1800s weren't a period of unprecedented construction but of reattribution? What if claiming these structures required establishing legal frameworks for ownership, for taxation, for control, income tax, property tax, utility bills? All these systems emerge or transform in the same narrow window of time, 1850 to 1913. All coinciding with the disappearance of Tartary from maps, the supposed construction boom of neoclassical architecture, and the mysterious shift away from atmospheric electricity research. The pieces connect. Here is what the connected pattern suggests. Before 1850, a civilization existed with sophisticated architectural technology, buildings that generated their own power, regulated their own climate, required no external utility infrastructure. This civilization, whatever it was called, whatever its structure, built on a scale and with a consistency that spanned continents. Then something happened. Not gradual decline, not slow conquest, but disruption. Maybe the mud floods documented in geological research, where cities across the world show evidence of being buried under meters of sediment in the mid-1800s. Maybe atmospheric catastrophe, like the 1780 Dark Day, or the 1816 year without a summer. Maybe deliberate destruction. Whatever the cause, the result was infrastructure without operators, buildings without inhabitants, technology without understanding. The inheritors, whoever they were, found themselves with magnificent structures they didn't build and couldn't fully comprehend. The buildings worked, certainly, but the underlying principles were unclear. How do you tax something that generates its own power? How do you control people who live in self-sufficient structures? How do you establish authority over populations that don't need centralized systems? You introduce dependency. You phase out the old technology, maybe claiming it is outdated, maybe just letting knowledge fade through deliberate neglect. You replace atmospheric power collection with coal, then oil, then centralized electric grids, requiring constant payment. You transform property from inheritance to commodity, requiring ongoing tax payments to maintain ownership. You create legal structures that make self-sufficiency difficult or illegal. By 1913, the transformation was complete. The Federal Reserve controlled currency, income tax ensured regular extraction of wealth from labor. Property taxes guaranteed perpetual payment for land and structures people thought they owned. Utility bills made survival dependent on corporate infrastructure. The old system, where buildings provided for their occupants, where architectural technology enabled independence, that system was gone, replaced with dependency. The evidence is still visible, the copper domes tarnished but intact. The ventilation systems still functioning, the geometric precision of facades designed for purposes we've been taught to ignore. Walk into any pre-1900 courthouse, library, or administrative building, stand in the central hall. Look up at the dome, notice how sound carries, how light filters, how air moves. These aren't accidents. These are features of engineered systems. But try to find documentation explaining how they work. Try to locate technical manuals for atmospheric electricity collection. Try to access research on architectural energy systems from the 1800s. The information has been archived, buried, or dismissed as pseudoscience. Not through conspiracy, through institutional neglect. Through the quiet decision that certain knowledge isn't worth preserving. What was lost? The ability to build structures that serve their occupants without requiring external infrastructure. The understanding of atmospheric electricity as a viable power source. The architectural principles that created self-regulating environmental systems. The social organization that made taxation unnecessary because buildings provided what governments now promise to deliver through tax-funded services. Taxation before 1913 existed, but it functioned differently. It funded specific projects, specific needs. It wasn't perpetual, wasn't inescapable. People could live outside the tax system without being criminals. But after 1913, after the transformation was complete, taxation became mandatory, universal criminal to avoid, because the alternative, the old system where buildings enabled independence, where architectural technology replaced centralized services, that alternative had to be eliminated. The buildings remember, even if we've forgotten. The dome still points skyward. The copper still conducts. The geometric patterns still resonate. The evidence persists in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to ask why these structures exist, why they were built this way, what they were designed to do beyond simply housing people. Your ancestors didn't pay income tax before 1913 because they didn't need to. The buildings provided. The architecture functioned as technology. The system was self-sufficient. Then, that system was replaced, deliberately, systematically, completely. And in its place, we received dependency, perpetual payment, inescapable taxation. The buildings still stand, hollow shells of a purpose we're no longer allowed to understand. And we pay, every month, every year, for services our ancestors received for free. Not because technology regressed, because knowledge was buried, because someone decided independence was too dangerous to allow.